Okay, so this is just a quick one in the light of the Bank of England's statement that they will carry out temporary purchases of UK government bonds as of now on whatever scale necessary. Necessary being to restore market function and reduce risks of contagion to credit conditions for UK households and businesses. Now, there's just a lot of moving parts here, so I was typing up the email and I thought, I'm just going to draw it out. So I'm just going to go through the major fiscal and monetary policy announcements in the past couple of weeks. Yes, this has all happened in the space of 2 weeks. And say what's the impact on demand and costs and therefore on inflation. And from that, hopefully we'll be able to say what the Bank of England is going to get pushed to next. So starting with the size of the initial shock, we estimate that the energy cost shock is going to amount to around 5% of GDP. But remember, that's not all taken out of demand. It's just a redirection of spending to different parts of the economy. In the UK case, a lot of that spending will simply flow abroad, representing a hit to GDP. Although that's less of an issue in the UK than it is for most of the rest of Europe, which is another reason why the unfunded fiscal spending to counterbalance the redirection of demand doesn't need to be quite so strong in the UK, because those resources remain within the UK economy, or to a larger degree at least. I.e. windfall tax, for instance, but that would be a major U-turn. Okay, so let's look at the net effect of this package. And it's probably quite a sizable bolster to demand in the first instance against that 5% of GDP hit that we talked about from the energy crisis. But it also pushes up underlying costs through the depreciation of sterling, but also by perpetuating demand at levels that are higher than they otherwise would be if the guarantee scheme wasn't in place. The Bank of England seems to be focusing it, for the moment at least, on the short-term impact on the figures, the actual inflation figures, with the price guarantee scheme preventing the full extent of the energy price shock from showing up. But the underlying pressure on inflation is upwards. Again, none of this is to say that fiscal support is the wrong choice. Governments across Europe are having to increase fiscal spending compared with their original plans, and that mix of looser fiscal policy and tighter monetary policy is probably the way to go in these circumstances. But now let's look at the mini-budget. The tax cut will provide little or no boost to growth. The multiplier on these tax cuts, especially because they're skewed towards the wealthy, is going to be very low. Whereas the market reaction with the leap in yields is going to more than offset any minimal boost from the actual tax cuts themselves. The property market simply can't handle this type of jump, and when you bring the property market in, then you start to get second round effects, and the likelihood is that the initial hit to growth then sort of multiplies. Going into this, it's possible that expectations for core inflation were a little on the high side. With oil prices falling, transportation costs would probably be a drag month on month going forwards. And China's PPI inflation, it looks like it's about to go into deflation year over year, while shipping costs have pretty much normalised. So while we remain less than sanguine on the path of the level of core goods prices in the US, where demand has remained relatively robust, in the UK case, there was a pretty good call for core goods prices actually to fall. The depreciation of sterling now looks like it'll more than offset the declines in the level of foreign prices of these goods. And I'll get some of those charts into our next note. It's worth bearing in mind, though, that this type of inflation in this environment where demand is weak does tend to peter out by itself, or at least in theory. So now let's bring the QE into the story. And at this stage in the game, it's supposed to be temporary QE followed by the QT that was originally planned to start, but is now being pushed back to October 31st. Right, let me just line these effects up a bit. I apologise, this is slightly messier than normal. I dropped my Apple Pencil, and they do say that the pen is mightier than the sword, but the pen is now broken, and therefore I'm having to use my fat finger. I feel like purposefully making your products breakable is quite monopolistic behaviour. Anyway, back to the QE. So the aim here is to just settle things down in the gilts market. So maybe we take off a little bit of that yield effect, but we add cost push inflation through the further depreciation of sterling. And though that type of inflation should die away over time, it does that because you're destroying demand in the shorter term. So what they're doing here is trying to balance the threat of rising yields with the threat of sterling depreciation, which really boils down to property versus cost of living. And if we come back to this idea of the threat from higher yields versus the threat from lower, weaker sterling, they're still sort of trying to have their cake and eat it. They're saying we'll prevent yields from rising by doing this temporary QE, but please believe us, we're not just monetizing the deficit and we're going to start QT again later. They're trying to calm down yields, but also at the same time convince FX markets that they're still credible against the government. Sterling doesn't really seem to believe that. It sold off in the wake of the announcement, although it has come back a little bit since. We think there are probably still further threats to sterling in the near term for a couple of reasons. The terminal rate priced into markets at the moment still looks unbearable from the perspective of property markets and the politics around that. The market implied terminal rate is now on the low side of 6% as opposed to above 6% before the Bank of England announcement. But that still seems aggressive given what's likely to happen to growth and potentially some downside surprises to inflation. The second headwind to sterling is that QT still seems unlikely. Unless the Chancellor resigns, and probably even if the Chancellor does resign, the issuance that the Bank of England can expect from the Treasury over the next 12 months is still going to be more than whatever it was when they were making their plans to do 80 billion of balance sheet reduction, roughly half of which is supposed to be through outright sales. So the pressure here seems to be coming down on weaker sterling in the near term. So the bank is probably going to have to hike the short end of the curve quite rapidly at the get-go. But the likelihood of actually getting to the 5.8%, 5.7% that is now priced in looks slim. Okay, thank you for taking the time to watch this, and we'll keep you updated and get a big picture written report with all the charts and all the trappings in front of you guys as soon as possible.